Okay, so I just looked up Incredibles 2 quotes. Hey, you did this. Can you undo it? You want me to uncrush?
Yes.
No one's ever asked for that.
Yeah, the to crush is, he says to crush is something, but to uncrush is silly.
Yeah.
He's the silliest possible superhero, right? All he does is crush things. It's completely, his superpower is to crush things, which is ridiculous, right? To crush, but to uncrush is silly. Yeah, I like that. I think it's clever. Hey, it's 11 o'clock. Okay, we can begin. Teams, can you hear me? And what do you see?
We see the lecture. I can hear you.
All right, good. So when I got to class today, I made a disastrous discovery. Not that bad, but what I discovered is that the PowerPoint presentation I sent myself to present today hadn't saved it. So I only got slides that'll take us up for another 10 minutes or something like that. Now I have my notes, which is what I used to lecture from anyway, without doing PowerPoints. But for much of the class today, you will not have the benefit of PowerPoints to focus your eyeballs on. And I almost apologize for that. And I say almost only because I'm not sure it isn't actually better that way. But before we get back to Dworkin and his criticism of positivism and other forms of positivism, I sent an announcement to you yesterday, I think I did, saying that I have posted the midterm grades, and I want to know if people are able to access the comments in Turnitin. You can get to the, because I've had complaints that I can't access the comments, so how can I improve? And you can do it. How do you do it? Is it trivial? And there's
Like you go to grades and then there's like a kind of arrow thing.
green arrow thing.
Yeah, so on Canvas, you go to grades, and then you'll see, it'll say midterm, and then on the right, it's like, it'll be green, and it's like the turn it in.
This is the thing that has the percent on it?
Right,
Yeah.
so how much it matches.
So you get there exactly the same way I get there.
On the left side of that, there's like a little message icon.
Okay.
If you press that, it'll.
All right. So you shouldn't have trouble doing it. Click around a little bit if you haven't succeeded, but I don't know how to explain it better than, what's your name again?
Bradley.
What Bradley just said. Just do what Bradley said, or figure it out. Or if you can't figure it out, then get in touch with me and I will try to walk you through it, but it shouldn't be difficult. Now, let me say about the midterms, there was a wide range of grades. Let me tell you something about how I do comments. The thing I want to say is that I forget, frankly, sometimes, that you are people with feelings. But mainly, I feel like you all deserve an A unless you demonstrate otherwise. And my job is to explain why you didn't get an A, if you didn't. Okay? So what you won't see is a lot of, good point, bravo, check, that's correct. I'm not going to bother telling you when you got something right, in particular, generally. But when you go off the mark, I feel like I better let you know, because that's where you need to know, that's what you need to know about. Not for your sense of, fuzzy goodness at the time, but so that you can improve. So do not take the fact that these, that I don't heap praise on individual things, things you said as an indication that there's something wrong with them. Generally, I won't have done that when you got something right. I'll just move along. Okay, that's right. Oh, no, I better say something here. That's how I do it. And please bear in mind, these are not tests of your moral worth or worth of as a human being. It's just a philosophy midterm. So always a good idea to keep that in mind. Any questions? Yeah.
How did you get to 40? Like, were you?
The midterm said 40.
Or is each essay worth 13.3?
Yes, 13.34 to be exact. In the sense that I constructed a chart on dividing the percentage number for an A minus, et cetera, right, by 13.34. And that gave me a number which, if I give you that number, that on a particular essay, you've gotten the lowest version of an A minus, say. So 0.9 times 13.34, whatever that is, that's the lowest number you can get to get an A minus. And then I decided, I mean, what I should have done really, what would make more, I don't know, arguably more sense is just give it a letter grade and then translate. But I sort of think in my head, this is a strong B plus, and then I figure out what that would be based on the grid I gave myself, or whatever you call it, the scale I gave myself. That answer your question in more detail than you really cared about? Yeah. Okay.
Well, no, not the last part.
No. Okay. How did I do it? Rationally, rationally. Which is not to say that, it's precise. I mean, that it's not precise. Grading is, if it's not a logic quiz in philosophy, the grading isn't precise. Can you see? I remember just hoping. Somebody said something here.
No, they're talking about the comment on the assignment.
Yeah.
I guess you can reply back. So they're asking if you can see their reply to your comment.
Oh, I'll have a look. I don't get an announcement when you apply. But I will go through. In fact, if you have put down a comment on Canvas that you want me to look at, send me an email saying I put a comment, because otherwise I'm not going to be like going back and looking at every hour or 3 hours or a day at all of them to see whether any comments have appeared. Okay. Now, back to, if there are no further comments or questions, Dworkin's criticism of positivism. So remember, Dworkin says positivism has 3 tenets, not tenants, as appeared in several people's midterms. A tenant is someone who rents an apartment from a landlord. A tenant is a fundamental principle of some organization or school whose tenants they are. Okay. So 3 tenets of positivism: laws, a system of rules, identifiable as by a pedigree test. So he conceives the rule of recognition as a pedigree test. Rules exhaust the content of law so that the case isn't covered by a rule. Judges have discretion to decide on extra legal bases how to rule in the case. And to say of someone that they have a legal right or obligation is to say that their case falls under a rule, so that when judges decide on a basis other than the rules, and they, they grant a decision for the plaintiff, right? They are according that plaintiff rights now that they didn't have at the time of whatever occurrence is the subject of the litigation. Okay. More specifically to Hart, dworkin characterizes Hart as saying that there are two kinds of authority for rules: acceptance as standards of conduct, or validity, passing the rule of recognition, which dworkin thinks is necessarily a pedigree test. So the rule of recognition in particular, an ultimate rule of recognition, has authority in virtue of its being accepted, right? But various other rules that pass the rule of recognition pedigree test have authority because they're valid. Okay. Why did that not? Okay. I honestly don't remember where we left off last time. This one, okay. So principles, okay. Basically what dworkin is going to argue that positivism is false because law includes principles, not just rules. And then he's going to say, because law includes principles, or rather we can see that law includes principles, it's kind of, his dialectic is a little fuzzy there. He's going to say, judges don't actually have discretion. He's going to argue that in a way that suggests that, well, principles are part of the law, but he's also going to be arguing that, well, principles are part of the law, so judges don't have discretion. But he thinks that the idea that judges have discretion is tied up with the claim that the law is, what he takes to be the positivist claim, that the law is exclusively a body of rules. Okay, but let's see. First, he's going to distinguish principles from rules. The principles are standards to be observed because they are requirements of justice or fairness or some other dimension of morality. Whereas a rule either applies to a case, in which case it controls the outcome, or it doesn't apply, principles can apply in full force without controlling the outcome, because there might be some other principle that outweighs them, or the rule, right, might outweigh the principle. But, right, the mere fact that that a case isn't decided in accord with some principle doesn't mean the principle didn't apply in the case. Whereas if a case is decided contrary to some rule, he thinks that means that the rule was not applicable. Principles are reasons that argue in one direction, and they have weight. So you could have two principles that apply that argue in different directions in a particular case, but one of them might be weightier. Okay, now, how are we to think of the relationship between principles and law? We got two basic options. We can regard principles as part of the content of law, which would be, he thinks, to deny the positivist thesis or tenet that law is a body of principle, of rules. As Hart puts it, it's a union of primary and secondary rules. Or, in the alternative, we can deny that they are a part of the content of law proper, with the implication that when judges appeal to principles in deciding cases, they're going beyond the law. On the first option, where principles are part of the content of law proper, judges would be obligated to apply principles. On the second option, if they do, it's only because, if they apply principles, it's only because they make it a practice to do so. And in that practice, they're stepping outside or beyond the law. On the first option, if we say principles are part of the law, we can say that a judge deciding a case by appeal to principles, we can still make out the case that they are discovering what the law is and enforcing existing obligations and rights. Right? If the principle by which I determine, for example, that Jane Roe should have been allowed to have an abortion, right? If that principle is already part of the law, then when I accord Jane Roe the right to that abortion, I'm simply saying she had it all along because the principle that was part of the law yields that result. If instead I say the principle, right, isn't part of the law, then when I accord Jane Roe the right to that abortion, I'm creating a right by appeal to extra legal materials. I'm inventing a new right. Dworkin now claims that positivists and their doctrine of discretion imply this second option, that positivists deny that principles are parts of the content of law proper. And before we get to Hart, I'll just tell you, Hart just denies this. He says principles can perfectly well be part of the law. No problem. This is what's known as soft positivism. It's the idea that principles as well as rules are parts of the law. But Hart will say, but that doesn't mean judges don't have discretion. Dworkin's going to say, oh, it means they don't have discretion in any important sense. And Hart will basically say, you can include the principles in the law if you like, but that doesn't mean that there's a univocal answer to the question, what are the rights in this case, given a hard case or a penumbral case. Dworkin is claiming, oh yeah, if you include principles in the law, then every case has a determinate correct answer. Okay. But the way that Dworkin argues here is quite slippery. He seems to indicate that if the positivist doctrine of discretion is correct, then positivists have to hold that, have to go for option 2 here. And then he says, so what we have to do is to examine the doctrine of discretion to help decide whether principles are or are not part of the law. So the idea is like, if discretion, then principles are not part of the law. So let's see whether discretion is true. And if it's not, then principles aren't part of the law, which is, that's a non sequitur. Right? I mean, it's to say, if A, then B, not A, so not B, it's known as denying the antecedent. So it just looks logically wonky to me. But in any event, that's almost just a logical quibble in light of the fact that Hart is going to say, fine, include principles, there's still discretion. Yeah.
What sense do judges have an obligation to apply principles?
Well,
Doesn't make sense.
because judges have to apply the law. That is relevant to the case. And if there's a principle that's part of the law that's relevant to the case, they have to consider it.
They have, okay, so, but, because there's the set, like, Dworkin says that sometimes you have laws and rules that both apply.
Right.
So it's obligated to, okay, so the judges are obligated to apply, but they're not obligated to determine.
Right. They're just, they're obligated to consider the application of principles to the case. But because principles are not necessarily outcome determinative, they can perfectly well consider it and find the other way. So they're finding a result inconsistent with the principle is not a matter of their not having applied the principle. It's a matter of their having applied it and it didn't control the case. Right. Amy, there we go. All right, and this is the last slide I have, so I'll be talking beyond that. Discretion. So here, Dworkin tries to get clear on the meaning of the expression or the term discretion. And he says, first, the concept of discretion is at home, as it were, only when someone has a decision to make that's subject to standards set by some authority. And then he distinguishes, it doesn't even really make sense the way he says it. But anyway, he distinguishes three kinds of discretion. First one called weak discretion A. And this is what happens when the application of the relevant standards requires some judgment. That is to say, when the relevant standards cannot be applied in a purely mechanical way. Okay, so when we face the question whether a tricycle, a motorcycle is a vehicle. Like, well, is a motorcycle a vehicle? And cars are clearly vehicles, but are motorcycles or bicycle? Is a bicycle a vehicle? That's a judgment call. But it's not because there's no standard there. Right? It's just because it's hard to say whether bicycles meet the standard. You have to exercise a little judgment. So another example, the example he gives, you're told a captain of a battalion or whatever, or a squad, the squad leader in a military situation is told, pick the 5 most experienced men for the patrol. That's the standard, most experienced. But experienced at what? I mean, that takes some judgment. You mean the ones that have been on the most patrols, the ones that have been in the most different kinds of missions, the ones, I mean, that requires some judgment. So that's weak discretion. Weak discretion B is just that when the decision is not subject to any standards of review. That is to say, it may be that the standards they may be weak discretion A as well, but it may be that the standards are perfectly clear. It's just that it's an unreviewable decision. So out calls by an umpire in baseball, at least before there was, are there any in baseball, are there any reviewable calls by, like there are in football, so that they can have another 8 commercials while they review the tape to see whether both feet were in bounds or something? Anyway, ball and strike calls in baseball, clearly unreviewable, but it's not a judgment call in the sense of either the pitch was in the strike zone or it wasn't. The strike zone is well defined, either the pitch is there or it isn't. The umpire gets to call it. He may misapply the standard and call what was a ball a strike, but it's unreviewable. Okay. Strong discretion, according to Dworkin, is when there is no standard on the basis of which a decision is to be made at all. So, for example, pick any 5 men for the patrol. Assuming there's only men in your, right, in your squadron, that sets no standard at all. Now, strong discretion does not imply uncriticizability. You can exercise it well or poorly. Right? If you pick the 5 men for the patrol who are drunk and wounded at the time, that's stupid. Okay? And criticizable. But that doesn't amount to saying that there is a standard to which the official is to adhere in making the decision. And they just, because that collapses it into just, it requires judgment. So weak discretion A. So what's the point of this distinction here? Dworkin wants to say it's only if principles are not part of the law that judges have strong discretion. That is to say, if judges have strong discretion, then it must be the case that principles are not part of the law. Okay, why? Well, because if principles are part of the law, then there's always some standard or other. Right? It may require an enormous amount of judgment, but if principles are part of the law, there's always some standard or other that, by means of which they are to make their decision. Yeah.
Is he denying MC? Does that sentence be like, judges have strong discretion? If judges have strong discretion, then they have law.
Yes.
So then,
Well, but if all, but okay, so yeah, if the argument is just if judges have strong discretion, then principles are not part of the law. Judges don't have strong discretion, so principles are part of the law. If that were just the argument, then yes, it would be that would be denying the antecedent. But the point is that the fact that sorry, now I'm getting lost in my own sauce here. If principles are the fact that if principles are part of the law, right? They're in fact, just by definition, they don't have strong discretion because the principles do provide a standard of some sort, even though it's one that requires a lot of judgment. Right? So the point is, if there are principles in the law, judges do not have strong discretion defined this way, because it's defined in terms of the lack of standards to be applied in the decision at all. But principles, right, are always present if they're ever present, and they always apply. Like here's a principle: do what is just in the case. Okay, that applies to every case. Okay, so if principles are part of the law, then there's a standard in every case. It may not be, right, it may require an enormous amount of judgment how to apply that standard, but as strong discretion is defined here, you don't have it. You have weak discretion A. But somehow, right, Dworkin thinks, I mean, look, it's all kind of irrelevant because Hart doesn't think, he doesn't accept that tenet that says all law is rules. So Dworkin is really arguing a straw man here. Maybe Austin thought that, but Hart didn't think that. Hart never thought that. So he's really arguing a straw man. And that's actually most of what Hart's reply is. Yeah, yeah, if I had said that, you'd be right, but I didn't say that. I don't believe that. I don't accept those principles, which if I did, you would, there would be a legitimate problem with my view, but I didn't say that. So, all right. So, yeah, that was the last one. All right. The question then is whether there is reason to suppose that principles are binding on judges. Right? If there are reasons for supposing that principles are binding on judges, then there's reason for denying that they have strong discretion. Right? Correspondingly, if there's reason to think that judges do not have strong discretion in cases where the rules don't determine the outcome, then there's reasons for thinking that principles are part of the law. So, are principles binding or not? Well, here's what positivists can't say. They can't claim that principles are not binding on the ground that judges are not criticized for not applying them, because judges are criticized for not applying them. Right? But you didn't do justice in the case. But you allowed someone to profit from their own wrongdoing. Right? Principles are often used to criticize judicial decisions, and judges are criticized when they don't apply principles of equity and fairness, etc., in their decision making. So not applying principles is a legitimate ground for criticizing judges. You also can't claim that they're not part of the law because they don't determine outcomes. That's just a way of saying they're not rules. Okay, that begs the question in favor of the claim that law just is rules, but the dispute here is whether law just is rules. So just saying, well, principles don't apply because they don't determine outcomes is a way of begging the question. Nor can you say that the authority and weight of principles are controversial. That just means that they require judgment in their application. Right? Nor can they say that principles are not binding because there's no rule of recognition for them. Now, this is more interesting. Here, Dworkin says the reason a positivist cannot reply principles aren't part of the law because there's no rule of recognition is that I'm attacking the whole positivist view here. Part of which is that the rule of recognition is a test of validity for everything. So only if you're committed to positivism as a whole could you say principles aren't part of the law because there's no rule of recognition for them. But I'm attacking the whole view. Which, again, it's not going to matter because Hart is going to say, oh, but A, principles can be part of the law, and B, there can be a rule of recognition for them. So, what up? What's up, Dworkin? So, Dworkin seems to take it that the fact of discretion is somehow part of the basis for Hart's theory of primary and secondary rules and a rule of recognition. Right? He seems to think, well, if there isn't discretion, then all that other stuff that the positivists say about rules and rules of recognition, etc., that goes out the board. But it's not at all clear that the reason that Hart argues that law is a system of rules and there's a rule of recognition is because there's judicial discretion. Hart could be right about primary and secondary rules and rules of recognition even without regard to the question of discretion. And if that's right, then he can deny that principles are binding simply because they're not valid. Say, yeah, principles, but in fact, he doesn't say that. He says, oh yeah, principles are binding and they're valid. Anyway, Dworkin now gives an argument to the effect that if principles are not binding, then no rule can be binding either. So how does that go? Well, it focuses on the question, what are the standards that determine when a judge may and when they may not overrule some precedent? If there are no such standards, if there are no standards governing when it is appropriate or permissible or inappropriate and impermissible to overturn a precedent, then right, no judge would be bound to follow precedent because they wouldn't be violating any standard in overturning it. But precedent is supposed to be a source of rules. So if there are no standards governing when you can overrule a precedent, then precedents don't establish rules. And therefore, judicial decision-making isn't bound by rules. Now, one thing you may ask is, well, what about statutes? Okay. But I suppose it's just a precedent that judges will apply statutes. So if precedent doesn't establish rules because there's no standards for when you can overturn and can't overturn precedents, then I guess, right, it's not a rule to follow statutes either. Anyway, that's the nature of the argument. And I think as far as it goes, that's fine. I mean, I think he's basically right about that. But he says, look, principles do figure in standards for how, so there are standards, there must be standards for when you can and can't overturn a precedent. And then he says principles figure in those standards. Any change, right, any overturning of precedent must advance some principle. And there has to be some standard for which principles count and how much in justifying the change, he says. Secondly, the judge has to take account of principles that argue in favor of abiding by precedent for its own sake and against changing it. So, there have to be standards for when you can and can't overturn a precedent, or there's no rules. But the standards for when you overturn a precedent involve principles. So principles are part of the law. Okay. Why has the view that principles are not part of the law been popular, that the law is a system of rules? Well, lawyers have been in the habit of thinking of laws as rules and of the law as a set of rules. But if you think that way and yet recognize that laws must sometimes be changed by judges, you will come naturally to the view that, well, then that's because judges have strong discretion. Right? Law is only rules. Judges have to change the rules sometimes, so they need principles by which to do that, but those principles aren't part of the law. So while they abide by principles in changing the law, those are not part of the standards that are officially imposed upon them because that's only the law. So they go outside the law to find standards to govern when they should and shouldn't overturn precedents. But as far as the law itself goes, they do that as part of their strong discretion because those standards aren't imposed on them officially. And there's a subtle consequence to thinking of it this way. The judges are going to recognize that principles make a difference. But Dworkin says what they're going to do then is think of them as sort of defective rules, standards that are trying and failing to be rules. Since they think of all law as rules, these principles that are trying but failing to be rules, if they are insisted upon, they will count, he says, as the rejected higher law. Right? Morality, say, which the positivists say is not binding, remember the separation thesis, and which then, if a judge appeals to morality, they do so only in a way that goes outside the law in their exercise of strong discretion. So Dworkin's point here is that he wants to resist in order better, like Fuller, to show the connection between law and morality. He wants to say, right, he wants to say that the reason the positivists are so dead set on the separability thesis, separation thesis, right, is that they see law as a system of rules. If they saw what judges do in appealing to morality as itself part of applying the law, right, they would not think so much in terms of the distinction between law and morality. So his idea is, people complain, positivists think the law needn't be moral, it's got nothing to do with morality. Saying, yeah, that's because they think it's rules. If they only realize that principles are part of the law, then they'd see that the law has got to have moral content. Yeah.
So your principles can mean a lot of different things, right? It could be like a moral principle, or on Dworkin's view, it could be a moral principle, or like a pragmatic principle, or any one of those things.
Well, I don't think he would say there are pragmatic principles. He's going to distinguish between pragmatic or policy considerations and principles. And he does define a principle as involving some dimension of morality or fairness. Okay, but why couldn't it be a principle that we should allow people to profit from their wrongdoing? Logically speaking, that functions as a principle. Okay, why couldn't that be a principle? He seems to just be denying that something could have the character of a principle that wasn't morally good, and I'm not sure why you would think so. Anyway, he does define them in terms of their involving a dimension of morality. All right, so next topic, the rule of recognition. Now he's going to take off after this idea. So we can't deny that principles are parts of the law, and Dworkin thinks that means we have to deny the doctrine of discretion, which, if we're to understand by discretion, strong discretion, he's right. And that's how he thinks positivists have to understand discretion. But the whole question is going to be, why do they have to understand it that way? Why isn't there enough discretion to make the point the positivists need, right, that sometimes judges make law? Even if all they have is weak discretion, that is, they have to exercise their judgment. What Dworkin really needs is for it to be true that including principles in the law means that there's only ever one defensible way to decide a case. That's what it would mean for judges, for the inclusion of principles in the law to make it the case that judges never, that judges always only find law and never make it. And that's what he wants to say. A judge who's doing his job properly never makes law, but only finds it. And he thinks including, right, principles in there is enough to make it the case that there's always a correct answer in any legal case. All right, but now let's look at to see what all of this means for the rule of recognition. And he thinks it means that we cannot accept the positivist doctrine of the rule of recognition. He claims that Hart conceives the rule of recognition as a pedigree test. And he also claims that there is no pedigree test applicable to principles. But since principles are law, the rule of recognition can't be a definitive test of the validity of law. It's really that simple. The problem here is that Hart doesn't think the rule of recognition is always a pedigree test. Moreover, what courts typically do, right, can itself be a pedigree test. That is to say, you want to know whether something's law? Look to see whether courts typically apply it or consider it. If courts typically do consider principles in making their decision, and part of the rule of recognition is what courts typically do is what courts typically appeal to is part of the law, then that's a pedigree test that includes principles. So Dworkin has simply too rigid a notion of what a rule of recognition must be like. Right? Hart is clear. It can be something grounded in the actual practices of judges and other officials in determining what the laws are. And it needn't be formulatable as a clear rule, the rule of recognition. Dworkin also argues that this fact that principles are part of the law but not subject to a rule of recognition obliterates the distinction between validity and acceptance. Since without a clear test of validity, which he thinks there can't be for principles, it appears that principles of the sort not authorized on a pedigree ground are, therefore, if they're employed, they must be employed on the basis of acceptance. But, right, the view was that everything other than the rule of recognition is authoritative because it's valid. So if principles are part of the law, they're authoritative, but they're not valid. So acceptance, so they must be authoritative as accepted. But that was supposed to be only what the rule of recognition was like. And right, so it blurs this distinction. And again, you just have to ask, just how rigidly does Hart, for his purposes, need to hold on to a rigid distinction between acceptance and validity? But moreover, right, Dworkin is just wrong that there can't be a rule of recognition for principles. That's what this argument depends on, and he's wrong about that. All right, now, hard cases. Here, Dworkin is going to argue that judges need not, even in hard cases, usurp legislative authority. So it is part of positivism that judges make law. And if they make law, they're they're functioning as legislators. That's supposed to be bad, anti-democratic, oh no, heaven forbid. Okay? Dworkin thinks, no, that would be bad. But look, even in hard cases, we do not have to conceive what judges do as making law. So contrast here acting as a deputy to the legislator from acting as a deputy legislator. Okay, what do I mean by that? And now I'm just going to turn off I'm going to stop sharing because I have no more slides to share with you. So how do I stop sharing?
You stop.
I stopped. Oh, so hello everyone. Now I take up your whole screen. I mean, rather and well, I'm trying to make it so that it's focused on me. I don't know how to do that. Oh well. That's what you'll look at. So, acting as a deputy to the legislator involves interpreting law in hard cases in accord with how you think the legislator would have acted had they understood the problem, had they thought about this case. Acting as a deputy legislator, on the other hand, involves making law in response to the kinds of arguments that would influence a legislator acting on their own. The difference between doing what you think the legislator would have done and doing what you think all in a legislator ought to do. To think in terms of what they ought to do is to take it upon yourself to consider the kinds of policy questions and, moreover, political pressures to which legislators are subject. To think only in terms of what you think the legislator would have said is just to try to, as it were, exercise only the authority that they would have, as they would have exercised it, and thereby not to consider policy considerations that they wouldn't have considered or that you think are better, etc. It's in other words, it's just trying to figure out what the law, what the authoritative law would have been, rather than trying to make up for yourself what you think it should be. So this is a subtle distinction, and probably in practice, it's just not the kind of thing that anyone could really apply. But he says if judges only act as deputies to legislators, to the legislators who wrote the laws in question, rather than as deputy legislators, then they're not usurping legislative function. The basic reason is that legislators are moved by arguments of policy. And judges are simply not supposed to consider arguments of policy. They are supposed to decide on the basis of arguments of principle. So what's an argument of policy? An argument of policy is something that justifies a political decision by showing that that decision advances some collective good of the community as a whole. So, for example, subsidies for aircraft manufacturers should be granted. That's good in the interest of national defense. That's a good policy for the community. An argument of principle, on the other hand, justifies a political decision by showing that it respects or secures some individual or group right. So, such things as arguments in favor of anti-discrimination statutes, or to ensure equal treatment for minorities. Those are arguments of principle. Those appeal to rights, okay? Secure rights. No one has a right to a subsidy in a contract. If you give them a subsidy for a contract, it's because you're trying to promote some social policy. Yeah.
Then should courts have been, okay, well, I guess a better question is, can legislators consider?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Right? They can, and they do. And it's only insofar as they would have considered arguments, well, a judge acting as a deputy to the legislature can consider the policy considerations that swayed a legislator only by means of applying the principle, I should not make law, but because I'm a democratically unaccountable official and not a legislator, I should not make law. I should only be a deputy to the legislator. And insofar as I'm doing that, I need to be attentive to the policy considerations they thought were important, but not to the ones I think are important. Then I start making my own law. Then you're a deputy legislator. Okay. Now, there are other sorts of political arguments, and these are actually what mostly move legislators. These are like securing special interest funding so that they can get, so that they'll get campaign financing and stuff like that. That's really what legislators, as the law and economics school tell us, that's what legislators really think about or care about. But policy and principle are basic kinds of political justifications. And what he's saying is, right, judges can perfectly well appeal to principle without becoming legislators, without usurping legislative function, because it's distinctive of the legislative function to respond to arguments of policy. So legislators can legitimately appeal to both policy and principle. In hard cases, it might look as though judges can do the same. And if they are entitled to act as deputy legislators, then they can. But Dworkin says judges should and typically do decide not on the basis of policy, but on the basis of principle alone. Yeah.
What would Dworkin idea of just acting as that ill intention?
Well, I think I would need to know more about the case. If their ill intentions are, for example, to subvert institutional practices required for the legitimacy of the state, then I think you can perfectly well use arguments of principle to, to rein in legislators who are doing that. But that wouldn't be just because you have a contrary policy preference. But it would depend upon the particulars of the case. If you thought they'd respond, if suppose a legislator doesn't like some particular kind of business and wants to pass laws to make that business impossible to pursue. It's not, and they don't have really good reasons for that. That could be ill intent, but it's not as obviously a case in which a judge could appeal to principle in opposing that. But principle is so frickin' slippery that you can make it say anything. You can say, oh, the principle is be equally fair to different kinds of businesses unless there's a rational ground for distinguishing among them. And your legislator's hostility toward that business is not a rational ground, and therefore I will, it's all so make-believe, this stuff, really, in a way. but he's the most important philosopher of law in the second half of the 20th century, accepting Hart and Raz and a bunch of others who are far better. But all right. So why is it so bad if judges make law? Well, basically two reasons, according to Dworkin. Legislation is supposed to be democratically sourced and accountable. Judges typically are not elected, and they're not accountable because they don't get thrown out of office for making decisions that people didn't like, at least typically. Secondly, if judges make law, then losing litigants are punished retroactively for violating duties that didn't exist at the time of the violation. Right? So if I now decide that the law shall be interpreted so as to, include tricycles among vehicles, and you're here because you had your tricycle in the park, and the cops threw you in jail because you had a tricycle in the park. And if I'm now determining that tricycles do count, and if that's just making law instead of finding law, then when you had the tricycle in the park, you weren't violating the law because it wasn't law yet. Now I've decided it's law, and I'm saying, yes, that person can be thrown in jail. I'm depriving you of your liberty on the basis of you're having violated a law, no tricycles in the park that didn't exist yet. So that's retroactive. Dworkin claims that these considerations, however, argue much more strongly against judicial decisions based on policy than they do on judicial decisions based on principle. Policy considerations involve compromises between competing interests with the overall good of the community as a whole as an end. And it's unclear that rational decisions can even be made on the basis of interpersonal comparisons of competing interests. Certainly there's no calculus available for doing so. So if judges start applying policy, they have to make shit up, because that's the nature of adjudicating, or rather weighing competing interests. There's no calculus for it. So whatever you come up with is going to be something you made instead of found. So decisions like that have to be made by a political process in which the various competing interests are represented. And that's not what happens in a courtroom. Okay? Moreover, legislation applies only prospectively. So it's clear that legislators, unlike judges, don't generate this second problem of retroactive. So don't act like if you're going to be a judge, you have a hard case, don't act like a legislator. Act in the place of the legislators who passed the law, but don't act like a legislator yourself. Yeah, Sam.
So does it present a problem for this potential weighing of anything if the judge has to weigh two competing principles and then determine how they interact, when they conflict with each other in the judgment of the case? Would then they be, if they're weighing the two principles, do they appeal to a hierarchy of principles? Do they create their own principles at that point? Is
A really, really good judge who's wise and smart and really knows all the law, he'll know exactly what the right thing to do is. It'll be, yeah. So competing, yes, principles do conflict with one another. They have different weights though, so always one of them is the strongest. And there's always a determinate answer to the question what the law was at the time, and that's what the judge discovers if they're doing their job correctly. It's not creative. Even though he's going to liken what a judge does to writing a chapter in a chain novel, still, he's just finding what always already was the best way to continue the narrative. It's not creative in the sense of making stuff up. It's creative in the sense of cleverly figuring out what was already there. A bunch of crap. Nonsense. Silly. But it's working. He takes rights seriously. Sorry. So the question is whether things are really any better in these regards when judges make decisions based on arguments of principle. And Dworkin, of course, says they are. Arguments of principle do not rest on assumptions about the demands of competing interests in the community. On the contrary, arguments of principle fix on an interest that a party is alleged to have as a matter of right. And get this, rights are insensitive to questions of competing policy interests. Bullshit. Sorry, Ron. Look, at a minimum, different interest groups, right, can be expected to care deeply about what principles we ought to recognize and how to prioritize them when they conflict. So Sam asked, what about when principles conflict? Different competing interests within society might very well have different views about what principles are the most weighty. And that means that means they have different views about what we should recognize as rights. That may not mean that arguments of principle necessarily rest on assumptions about how the competing interests, right, would weigh the principles, but they may well. Anyway, Dworkin's arguments can only work, let's be clear, they can only work if we allow that principles always are not themselves grounded on policy. Think about, go back to law and economics stuff, right? Toward the end, there was argument with respect to, for example, the way that property rights preserve efficiency. The argument was efficiency is a matter of wealth maximization, and at least arguably, the justification for the recognition of rights in property and even to your person is that maximizes wealth. But if the right to the integrity of your person is based on the policy that we should maximize wealth, then an argument of principle is itself grounded in policy. Dworkin needs it to be the case that principles have some like non-policy related foundation. And it's far from clear that they do. This would be something like the question that comes up, and we'll get to it with Hart next time, of the objective standing of moral principles. Hart is going to say, it's a contested question whether moral principles have objective standing. Dworkin seems to think that his view involves essentially the idea that moral principles have objective standing, and that the law, and that therefore, since they're part of the law, there's objectivity in the law. And Hart's going to say, look, completely contestable whether moral principles have objective standing, And a philosophy of law, a jurisprudence, theory of what the law is, just shouldn't take a stand on such a contested philosophical question. Dworkin's theory kind of forces you to start saying that's a problem for his theory. Why would you want your theory of what a legal system is, but we'll talk about how that's not really what Dworkin wants to do here. Why would you want your theory of the law to be captive to a contested philosophical question like the objectivity of morals? All right. Say a little bit more, and then we'll quit. A little bit more just about retroactivity. Why is making decisions on the basis of principle not a way of making retroactive law, whereas making decisions on the basis of policy would be? If a court decides on the basis of principle and finds in favor of one party against another, then it's just recognizing the second to have violated a right of the first. It's not creating a right. The court could be wrong about what the rights were all along, right? But that's not because of the originality of the decision. That is to say, prior cases may just have been wrong about what the rights were. Okay? So in recognizing now a right that wasn't recognized before, that doesn't mean we're inventing the right. Violating a precedent as to what people's rights are may be, in fact, discovering that the precedent was wrong, not creating a new right. So think of Brown versus Board of Education, in which it's decided that people have a right to integrated education, not be segregated. Separate is not equal. That directly overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, that equality does not require, equality is, segregation is consistent with equality. Okay? The idea here is that the Brown versus Board of Education court didn't invent a new right, the right to integrated schooling. It simply thought more clearly about the law, including the Plessy precedent, and realized that Plessy was wrong and that all along people had a right to integrated education. If they were just making a decision on the basis of policy, wouldn't it be nice if, you know, let's as a policy matter integrate because we think that African Americans will benefit from it, right? That's changing policy course and therefore inventing rights that weren't there previously. Yeah.
Is that the problem from Georgia that, like, at the time of Plessy, up until Brown v. Board, didn't talk about, they didn't see themselves as having rights. They saw themselves as, like, not having that right until Brown v. Board. Like, the way that the common parlance was about or talked about the right to desegregated education, for example, was completely, I mean, it would require like some kind of gymnastics.
Well, I think it's a horrible problem for him, but he'll just say, oh, someone who was really smart and paid attention to all of the laws and including all of the principles would have known that the best, most consistent story we can tell about the American political narrative, the best narrative we can give is one in which there always was that right and people failed to see it until the Brown board saw it. The Brown the Brown court saw it. Rather, the Warren court deciding Brown saw it.
When people say prior to Brown v. Board, we don't have this right, but we should have it.
They were just
They're
mistaken.
saying that this right is not recognized.
Right.
We do have it.
Yes, that's right. Now, obviously here, Dworkin is assuming that arguments of principle always determine only what the party's rights were and never indicate how we ought to take them henceforth. And that can only be true if arguments of principle concerning what the law is always have completely determinate answers. That is, if the law, including principle, always determines the right outcome in a case. And you just got to be nuts to think that. Or you have to invent Hercules the super judge. Mr. Incredible, the super judge. Get back to it. All right. We'll pick up here and dust off this particular topic next time and perhaps move on to the next, which I don't remember what it is. Okay. Like I said, if you entered comments about your midterms, please let me know independently so I know to go look for them. Thank you. Thank you.